It is wonderful to welcome you here today. I am Sally Howard, one of the priests, one of the associate rectors on staff here at All Saints Church. My pronouns are she, her. I want to also just welcome you to this place of radical inclusion, courageous love, and joyful spirituality. We put our faith into action every week, and this week we are asking you to sign a letter to Gavin Newsom supporting the efforts to settle a contract for Kaiser mental health clinicians, encouraging him to support a contract that would move mental health care towards parity with other areas of health care, and that's so needed. So please sign the letter at the action table. And it is really, speaking of joyful spirituality, it is such an amazing honor and joy to get to introduce to you today Reverend Dr. Will Gafney. She is a prophet, a poet, and a professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. She is an Episcopal priest, canonically resident of the Diocese of Pennsylvania and licensed in the Diocese also of Fort Worth. She's also a former Army chaplain and a congregational pastor in the AME Zion Church, a former member of the Dashai Darak Reconstructionist Minyan of the Germantown Jewish Center in Philadelphia. She has co-taught courses with and for the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Seminary in Wyncote, Pennsylvania. And she is author of several books and is currently working on a women's lectionary. And if you were in the service today, you had the treat to hear one of those lectionary readings, or stick around for the 11:15. Absolutely powerful and beautiful. And she is, in that lectionary, a new women-focused calendar of Sunday readings for liturgy and preaching. And her translation is poetic. Also, we are offering today one of her books, Womanist Midrash. I own this myself. It is, again, a powerful, enriching, and, dare I say, healing understanding of Midrash. So, without further ado, may you welcome with me, please.
Good morning. Do we need this? Can I just move it away? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for spending part of your Sunday morning with me. Again, my name is Will Gafney, and I'd like to talk to you about the way in which virtually all of us encounter the biblical texts that we may not think about, and that is through translation. So first, I'd like to do an exercise with you and have you think out loud, that means you have to talk to me, about what the biblical text is, or what the biblical texts are as a collection, as physical objects. I'm not asking specifically about your religious investment in them, but I want to talk about them as material objects, where they come from, and how we get them. So I think the best way to do that is to go back in time. So I know you're Episcopalians, but does anybody actually have a Bible? Okay. All right, we're off to a good start. So, just one person, from whence did you acquire your Bible? Just one person. From your sister, okay. Okay, sisters are giving Bibles. We've got a couple people who've gotten Bibles for sisters. If you have some other kind of sibling, you're out of luck, apparently. So somebody bought their Bible in a store. So where did the store get their Bibles? The sisters presumably were at a store at some point. Where did the stores get their Bibles? Publishers, warehouse in the middle there. Publishers set words, generally on paper, in print, even when it's a digital printing process. When a publisher publishes a volume of anything, they obtain the rights to publish it. Who holds the rights for biblical texts? The rights for specific translations are held by the communities that sponsor and produce them. So the New Revised Standard Version, which many people encounter in churches and universities and seminaries, is sponsored by the National Council of Churches, and they hold a copyright. So if All Saints wanted to do a congregational study Bible, they could get permission to print an All States version, but it would come with rules because they hold the copyright. So you'd have about 4 choices: with all of the biblical texts that we read as Episcopalians, or with the short Protestant version, because it comes in 2. And with those little headlines that says, creation, first day, and without those titles. But the titles themselves can't be changed because they're a package, because they hold the copyright. So that text of the NRSV is copyrighted by those who produce the translation. What is translation, and how does that get us a copy of a Bible in a store for somebody's sister to buy and give? What's that part as we're going backwards? So we haven't even gotten all the way back. It's a very slow time machine rolling back. Okay, so people who know other languages working with earlier texts. The biblical texts are not in English. Most of y'all know that, but there are still a few people who say Jesus spoke King James English. But curiously, not Tyndale's English or Wycliffe's English. That's another lesson. So the texts from which Bibles are translated, collections of biblical texts are translated, scriptures are translated, we talk about them as being original language manuscripts, but not original manuscripts, because we don't have original manuscripts. Even our oldest and most complete manuscripts of the biblical collections are themselves copies of copies. Does anybody know what the oldest and most complete collection of ancient biblical manuscripts are? It's the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why they're so important. That's also why we have an NRSV. We used to have an old RSV. Of course, it wasn't old then, so it was just RSV, the Revised Standard Version. And just when it was finished, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And one of the things we learned is that they have material that is older than any of the manuscripts that we had at that time, material that agreed with some older manuscripts, commentaries, things like Josephus and some other ancient texts that now we know what they were talking about, that they didn't make up, but that they had access to these texts that we hadn't had. And the NRSV is a correction of the RSV with about 90 updates in it. So we have these ancient manuscripts. Now let's go all the way back to what I like to talk about as a God event. Something happens. Moshe is walking around on this mountain, Moshe, Moses, by one name or another. He has some kind of adventure. That's the God moment. How do we get from this person having an extraordinary day to some of us having biblical texts on our tablets, phones, devices, and in the Bibles our sisters gave us? What has to happen when this person has this day? Ma'am? You got to tell somebody, right? So he has an adventure. It's like tree, fire, talking, I don't know. Call me by name. It was a whole thing. Not only do you have to tell people, but somebody has to think there's something to that story, right? Because if your people saying, look, you need to stop eating falafel before bed, that story isn't going anywhere. But when your children's children say, Tio Moses, tell us the story about the bush. Tell us that story. And the next generation says, my grandfather Moses used to tell us this story. There was this day he was on the mountain. Those stories become canonized in the telling. The community says, this story, this just wasn't a falafel dream. There was something happening there. So we have a community that affirms a story even before it's written down, so that when the time comes to write stories, people say, there's this story that we have always told, and that should be in this collection. Now, those stories got written down in different ways. And perhaps one of the most misunderstood aspects of doing biblical translation is that there is not a manuscript or a couple of manuscripts. There are hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of manuscripts that are reconciled in the sort of professional, critical manuscripts that those of us who are biblical scholars use, with lots of footnotes and annotations and things. So the path from God's space, an encounter that this person had with God, to text on a tablet runs through manuscripts in other languages, and the work that interests me most, that has been my work for 20 some odd years, translation. Now, part of that is choosing the manuscripts. And so when I translate, let me back this up. What languages are the biblical materials in? What are the original biblical languages? Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek, right? Every once in a while there's a contorted Egyptian word or something else in there, but those are the big three. So translation then is rendering. In Womanist Midrash, I do a whole appendix on translation, and I commend it to you. It's more in detail than anything I can do there. But one of the things I say is, how do you explain what translation is without using a verb to substitute for translation, right? So translation is taking a text in one language and putting it in another language, rendering it into another language, making it clear in another language, circling back around, translating it to another language. There's a way in which talking about translation is kind of a hamster on a wheel. So we have the originating languages, and we have the reading, hearing language. We talk about source language and target language. And so we've got to get a text that is an Iron Age text with some Stone Age ethics in it across to digital people. We have to get a text in a language that in one canon is rigidly binary. People are just in two pots, sort yourselves out. Those are all the pots we got. You just got to make it work. To, in another testament, one that has three options, but is not following the two pots that we have when we have the pots, and is moving some stuff around. We go from a language, and when I get really philosophical about Hebrew, I say things like, I don't even know if we can say that biblical Hebrew has verbs. I mean, is it really a verb if when you add a conjunction that changes the tense so it moves from past to present? Is that really a verb? Biblical Hebrew doesn't have a present tense. So what do we do with the philosophical notion, the theological notion that God was, is, and is to come? You can't say that in Hebrew because you don't have present tense in the middle. So how do you take these two worlds and do a power move and bring them together so that people can engage these texts? That's the work of translation. But as you know, in this church, perhaps more than some other places, translation doesn't just happen on a laptop or a pad or even a clay tablet. People do translation. And people have flesh and experience and culture and ideas. And so the work we produce, whether it's translating or baking or painting or writing poetry or preaching, is always enfleshed, incarnational work. But there were some people who were so convinced that their incarnation was the standard of all incarnations, and the thoughts that were shaped by their incarnation were the thoughts of all people, that they didn't talk about or even really think about what their gender, their maleness, their presumptive heteronormativity, their whiteness, their eliteness in education, which I also share, how all of these things shape them. So that's how you can get a text that was my entree into translation that let me know just because it was on the pages of the Bible didn't mean it was right, was when I heard. Now, I was a special child. I loved languages. I started teaching myself Hebrew way before I went to seminary. I grew up speaking a couple of languages, and I have the ability to puzzle them out. I'm not fluent in Arabic, but I can eavesdrop in Arabic. I can translate what I hear. I can't respond, but I will know all your business. So I knew that this conjunction, I might not have known its name, that it was a vav, that it was pronounced v, but I knew it was conjunction, junction, what's your function? I knew that it connected things, and I knew that it meant and that Hebrew really doesn't have a but. You have to do a bunch of stuff to make it a disjunction, right? And I knew that it was wrong in the King James Bible that I grew up with, where it said, I am black, but beautiful. Because the people translating that could not see blackness as beautiful. And so their whole identity went into that one conjunction, saying, in spite of being black, she's all right, right? But that is not what the text said. And so that was the first place where I understood that people make choices when they translate it, and those choices affect what we hear. What is it that we say on social media? What? TLDR, too long, didn't read it. If you want to read it, the work that I do in this book, Womanist Midrash, does some of that unraveling. And so I come to the work of translation with my whole body and my whole self. And I translate not just for women. The lectionary that I'm working on is a women's lectionary because it centers women in the biblical text. And it is for the church. It is for all people. It is for people who don't identify with a single gender. It is for all. But it is focusing on these characters who are already on the margins of scriptures, and then even further on the margins of our lectionary. If you've been hanging out in an Episcopal church for a while, you know we don't get the women's stories that we have, right? The Bible is already grossly androcentric, right? The biblical texts focus way more on men. Yet, there are, for example, just in the Hebrew Bible, just talking about women who have names in the text, not even counting the mother of and all the people who are just used as verbs to move the story along and as literary incubators, but characters who have a name in the text. I might have said this when Austin was here, so if you heard me say it then and you guess, it doesn't count. But how many women whose names are preserved do you think we might have in the whole First Testament? Not even counting the middle part with Judith and all that. Give me a number. You were listening. 111. I always say 111T, because, there's a couple that are a little wiggly. So many. We only have 52 Sundays in a year, in theory. If we could work the texts into the shape of our liturgical year, focus on Advent, focus on Epiphany, we could tell stories about God, even stories that don't make God look good, because often the stories come out really differently when you start putting the women on the page. We could have a completely different way of telling the stories. And so that's the project of the lectionary. So what I'd like to do now is give you an example, and it will be easier for me to do it from the book, do a couple of examples of what this sounds like when I do it and what it might offer to the congregation. So we started talking about the work of translation. So translation occurs in largely a continuum. One end of that continuum is what's called formal equivalence. And it's what most people imagine translation is, like word for word, finding the right word that matches this word and putting those words together on the page. But because the languages are so different, all translations have to move over towards what is called dynamic equivalence. And when you get to the far end of dynamic equivalence, which is where I'm not a particular fan, then you get periphrastic things like the Message. But there's a lot of space in the middle. So let me give you an example of a small line of text that most of us knew, even if we were not religious. The Lord is my shepherd is the way that many people have learned the intro to that song. But what does it say? So the first thing it says is, Mizmor LeDavid. There's a first line in all Psalms that for whatever reason, the church has taken to throwing out the lines that contextualize them, the lines that give musical direction. So Mizmor David is a psalm that is to or for David. And so there's a whole nother conversation about whether or not David wrote these psalms or somebody wrote them down for him or they were dedicated to him. Because what they don't say is what is going to be at the top of almost all of your Bibles, which is a psalm of David. That's a different grammatical experience. And so once I had my experience with the butt of the Song of Songs, then I sort of collected these almost like grudges, right? Like places where I knew the text said something else, but they were doing something else, like giving David credit for the Psalter, because that's what the church has always done, but that's not what the text says, right? Or the young woman who conceives a child in Isaiah who's not a virgin in that text in Hebrew, right? And so I have this list, and I was going somewhere with that, and I almost lost it. So I'm trying to swim in the middle, as close to formal equivalence as I can. And we have the verse, Mizmor LeDavid. The first part is a song of David. Adonai ro'i lo echsar. And then we start with what we learned in English, the Lord is my shepherd. But we can't even do that because there is no definite article, there's no the there. The is implied by the use of a proper name that is functioning as a title, but it doesn't say Lord because God's name isn't Lord. Lord is the thing we say because we can't actually say God's name, which are four sacred letters that have kind of a footnote system that tell you to say something other than try to pronounce what's there. And so what we have used, what was used in the Hebrew Bible and in rabbinic literature and going today, are a number of options. The most common was Lord. So you get the Holy One whose name cannot be pronounced is my shepherd. Well, there's not actually a form of the verb to be there. And, well, shepherd is a noun, and it's not really a noun. It's a participle that's functioning as a gerund with a article integrated on the back, the one who pastures me or the one who shepherds me, right? So, is the translation the Holy One, and we'll talk about God language in a minute, the Holy One is my shepherd, wrong? It's not wrong. But you had to do a lot of tap dancing to get it there, because these languages don't work in the same way, right? And we might not have a lot at stake when we try to figure out, well, can we translate shepherding verb with the noun shepherd, because participles do become substantive in Hebrew, right? I gotta tell you, the first time I taught Hebrew, I was appalled because nobody knew what a gerund was, and I realized I had to teach English grammar. So we who do this work of translating are trying to be as faithful as possible to the text and as faithful as possible to the hearing, reading audience. And depending on the translator, the investment in one or the other is going to shift. This women's lectionary has moved me closer to my reader-hearers than I might do otherwise, taking seriously that women and feminine gendered persons and entities and language, descriptive language for God, are there in the text, but we don't get them depending on who translates and then who selects what text for the lectionary. So I'm going to go back to the verse that if you were in service this morning, you heard for the first reading, and if you stay, you'll also hear for the first reading. And for those of you who have a book, I'm doing page 20. And I'm going to back up a little bit. So the way that we translated, the way that I translated, and they reproduced Genesis 1 and 2, in the beginning, He, God, created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and shapeless, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while she, the Spirit of God, pulsed over the face of the waters. I changed the verb when I gave them the lessons. I'm always tinkering with it. It'll never be done. God introduces God's self, and God uses, or the texts use, the texts disclose on behalf of God, two different verbs with two different genders. The Spirit of God is always feminine in Hebrew and Aramaic. It just is. Some languages have gender for everything. La mesa, right? La table. Like languages just work that way. And so there's three types of gender. There's biological gender. So, you know, when you get a she-ass, which is a word the Bible likes, or a cow, it is biologically feminine. So that's biological gender. You get grammatical gender for objects, everything, trees, cookies, you know, all have gender. That's grammatical gender. And then you get what I call ontological gender when we talk about God, that gendered words are used, but what are we actually saying that means in terms of what it is to be God, to have a body, to have an essence. The Bible likes to give God parts, a strong right arm, feet for the footstool, you know, God's enemies in the earth are under God's feet, God's eyes are open, God's ears are open, the mouth of the Holy One has spoken. The only reproductive parts God has are a womb. And it's the same in Hebrew and in Arabic. So in Arabic, when we talk about God as being al-Rahim, full of mercy, is really full of mother love. That same verb in Hebrew, raham, the root of that is the womb. So it's sort of like saying, I have a headache. I can't explain to you the feeling without naming the part, right? It's not just, I'm hurting today, I have a headache, I have a backache. The feeling is connected to the place. And so when God loves, one of the two words that God uses to love people, it is this verb, rahum, which I didn't come up with this translation. Phyllis Tribble did this maybe in the 70s. She called it womb love. I call it mother love, right? That God mother loves us. So even when the biblical text is using a masculine pronoun and gendering the verb masculinely, it will still say that God mother loves us, right? So there are these places that, and the way that men have translated that, pity or compassion. So think about this verse. Does a mother have pity or compassion on the child she is carrying? No. Does a mother have mother love for her child? When Solomon divided the baby, threatened to divide the baby, and the birth mother said, let her have it, don't hurt the baby, the text says her mother love rose up in her. You will see that translated as her bowels of compassion or something like that. Really? Okay. So thinking about what it means that the Spirit of God is always disclosed with the feminine gender in the first part of our scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. In Greek, it will become neuter, which is whatever it is, that's fine. But then the church gets stuck with a masculine spirit because Jerome, 400 years after Christ, performs unauthorized and not volunteered for word gender reassignment on the Spirit of God. He chooses a gender that is not in any of the scriptures of the church, a gender that just happens to be his. So I do this little box on page 20 where I take a bunch of verses and say, imagine what it might have been like for you growing up, whether you see yourself as having a single gender, genderful, woman, man, femme, man, wherever you are. Imagine if you heard language for God other than he, him, father, and king. So if you put the gender of the Spirit back to what it is in Hebrew, then you get verses like, the Spirit, she rested on them. The Spirit, she wore Gideon like a garment. The Spirit of God, she came upon David. The Spirit of God, this is one of my favorite ones in Job. It's often on my email. The Spirit of God, she has made me, right? There are a good 30 places, and I give you all the verses so you can look them up and do your own study. It changes for me how I engage the text. And ironically, that is a form of biblical literalism, right? That's what the text says. Now, my translation practice has a range of things, but for me, it's rooted in what does the text say? And also, for whom am I translating? One of the challenges of the Lectionary Project is that I am translating in a world that is no longer binary. And by emphasizing the presence of women and girls, I have put a foot kind of firmly on the binary side of the world. I'm also using inclusive language and a range of language. But here's my challenge. What I have learned is that for people who experience God and only learned about God with masculine language, when you start to say creator and shepherd and redeemer, that doesn't dislodge that image. It's only when you say she, in my experience, that image is interrupted for good or for ill. So that is a part of what the work is. In terms of the technica, as I said, I have a whole translation appendix there. And I do things like try to find the best fit in the range of words. English has probably 50 to 60 words for every word in Hebrew, right? And so sometimes it's not just a matter of what does this word mean, but what does it mean here in this place, and which of all of our words can be utilized. So I'm going to give you an unpleasant one. There's a text where after Deborah has led the Israelites to victory, and in the lectionary I tend to say the women and men of Israel. Occasionally when there's some event and I know children were there, I might say everybody or add the children, but I specify the people in their bodies. That in the world of the text, some are women, some are men. That there is a general who hasn't made it home yet. And there's a court scene, and his mother is with the royal ladies, and she's saying, why isn't he here? He's probably gathering spoils of war. And what the translations tend to say, and gathering girls. But what the text does in Hebrew is it uses that same anatomical body part. And so you have the bizarre situation where a mother knows that her son is a rapist to the point that if he's not back from the war yet, it's raping time. Like that's what she's saying, right? But she's not saying he's collecting wombs. We have this word womb that's this kind of neutral that we use in Scripture. She's not using a medical term. He's collecting uteri or even vaginas, right? She's using a word that you probably wouldn't want me to read over the text. He's out getting him some, you could probably put a C word in there, you could put a P word in there, you could put all kinds of words in there. The way in which she's using it calls for an ugly word, right? So even though there's the one word in Hebrew, someplace else I might have used that as womb, someplace else I might have used that as belly, but there, I got to use something profane, right? So part of the work of translation is figuring out what is called for in each place. I have no idea where we are in time. I was going to say, and I wanted to hear back from you guys, and I'm so sorry. I didn't give you talk back time. Oh, thank